You ever notice how the people carrying the most dangerous secrets are usually the quietest ones in the room? The storm rolled across northern Alaska like a living wall, swallowing the mountains behind Fort Sentinel in sheets of snow and freezing wind. Visibility had dropped below 30 feet, and the emergency floodlights surrounding the base flickered every few seconds under the pressure of the Arctic cold. Inside the operations building, heaters rattled loudly against the metal walls while officers crowded around glowing digital maps, arguing over disappearing drone feeds and corrupted satellite data. Nobody noticed the woman walking through the outer checkpoint alone. She wore a faded gray winter coat dusted with snow, dark cargo pants, and heavy black boots scarred by years of ice and rock. A long cylindrical case rested against her shoulder, sealed with two faded red security locks that looked older than most of the soldiers stationed there. The guards near the entrance barely glanced at her before returning to their conversation about delayed supply flights and broken generators. Captain Ethan Cole stood near the tactical table sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup as another young lieutenant laughed beside him. "Weather gets worse every year," the lieutenant muttered. "At this point they should just abandon this frozen dump." Ethan smirked without looking up. "As long as command keeps paying us, I'll freeze with a smile." Then he finally noticed the woman entering the war room. She moved quietly, almost too quietly for someone dressed in thick winter gear. No rank patch. No visible insignia. No escort. Just a calm expression and pale blue eyes that scanned the room once before settling near the digital map wall. Ethan exchanged a look with the others nearby. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, the sarcasm already hiding inside his voice. The woman didn't answer immediately. She removed one glove slowly, brushing snow from the side of the black case with steady fingers marked by old frost scars across the knuckles. "Delivery for command operations," she said calmly. Her voice was low, controlled, almost emotionless. Ethan chuckled softly. Command operations doesn't use civilian couriers during active alerts. A few nearby officers laughed under their breath. One of them leaned closer and whispered, probably another intelligence contractor trying to feel important. The woman ignored the comment completely. Outside, the storm slammed against the reinforced windows hard enough to shake the glass. Somewhere deeper inside the base, warning alarms briefly chirped before cutting silent again. The tactical screens flickered. One feed disappeared entirely. "We lost drone Echo 7 again," somebody shouted from the communications desk. "Signal interference near Sector 12. Frustration spread across the room instantly. Officers crowded around the display while radio chatter crackled overhead. Ethan stepped in front of the woman now, blocking her path toward the main table. "Look, ma'am, this area is restricted during tactical operations. If you're lost, admin offices are across the south corridor." Another officer grinned. "Or maybe she's here to fix the coffee machine." More laughter followed. Still, the woman showed no reaction. She simply looked past them toward the frozen satellite map displayed on the wall. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "Your coordinates are inverted." Nobody answered. For a second, only the sound of the storm filled the room. Ethan stared at her before shaking his head with a short laugh. "Right. And I'm supposed to believe the mysterious map lady understands Arctic tactical grids better than military intelligence." The woman slowly set the black cylindrical case onto the steel table. The heavy metal locks clicked against the surface with a sharp sound that somehow silenced the room more effectively than shouting ever could. Then she finally looked directly at Ethan Cole for the first time. "No," she said quietly. "You're supposed to notice your team is walking into the wrong valley." The room stayed silent for 3 long seconds after the woman spoke. Snow hammered the reinforced windows while the tactical screens continued flashing corrupted data across the walls. Captain Ethan Cole stared at her with the same expression people used when they thought confidence alone could win an argument. Around him, several officers exchanged amused looks, waiting for somebody to throw her out before the situation became even more ridiculous. The woman remained completely still beside the steel table, one hand resting lightly on the black cylindrical case as if the storm outside did not exist. Ethan finally let out a dry laugh and shook his head. "That is interesting," he said. "Especially considering you have not even seen the full operation briefing." A communications specialist nearby raised his headset. "Signal loss spreading through Sector 12 and 14, he called out nervously. "Ground team cannot maintain stable contact." Another officer cursed quietly under his breath. The satellite map glitched again, causing several red route markers to shift nearly 2 miles east before stabilizing. The woman watched the movement carefully. Her pale eyes followed the frozen terrain lines with unsettling precision. Ethan noticed it but dismissed the feeling immediately. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "This base is under active emergency protocol. If you are some contractor from Washington, this is not the time." She looked at him calmly. "Your team entered Raven Pass 30 minutes ago." Ethan frowned. Nobody outside command should have known that route designation. Before he could answer, she continued. "But the weather drift pushed your extraction corridor west by 4.6 miles. The valley you marked safe on your map is a dead signal zone after dark." One of the younger lieutenants scoffed. "How would you even know that?" The woman slowly removed her second glove. More frost scars covered the side of her hand, old and pale beneath the emergency lights. "Because I spent 11 days trapped there during Operation White Ember." The room quieted slightly. A few older officers exchanged uncertain glances at the mention of the operation. Ethan noticed it immediately. White Ember was not common military history. Most personnel at Fort Sentinel had only heard fragments about it through classified Arctic survival briefings. An entire reconnaissance team lost during a blizzard nearly a decade earlier. 2 survivors recovered. Files sealed afterward. Ethan crossed his arms. Convenient story. She ignored the comment completely and stepped closer to the frozen map display. Nobody stopped her this time. She studied the terrain for several seconds before pointing toward a narrow line hidden between overlapping digital layers. "Your drones are losing signal because the storm is bouncing interference through the glacier walls here." One officer narrowed his eyes. "That canyon is not on the public grid." "No," she replied quietly. "It was buried after the ice shift 6 winters ago." The communications desk suddenly crackled with distorted audio. Static flooded the room before a weak voice finally pushed through. "Command, this is Falcon Team, navigation is off, terrain does not match the map." Every conversation inside the war room died instantly. Ethan slowly turned toward the radio operator. "Repeat that transmission." More static answered first. Then the voice returned, strained and broken beneath heavy wind. "We cannot find extraction point, visibility collapsing." The woman closed her eyes briefly as if recognizing the exact sound of panic hidden beneath controlled military discipline. Then she opened the black cylindrical case for the first time. Inside rested an old folded map protected beneath layers of weatherproof plastic. Unlike the glowing digital displays surrounding them, this map was covered in handwritten markings, faded coordinates, and precise notes written in dark ink across nearly every inch of the paper. Several officers stepped closer without realizing it. Ethan looked down at the map and felt his confidence slip for the first time that night. Across the top corner, barely visible beneath years of wear, was a classified military stamp followed by a single name. Captain Claire Donovan. The storm outside intensified until the entire operations building groaned beneath the pressure of the Arctic wind. Snow struck the reinforced windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against steel. Inside the war room, nobody laughed anymore. Officers crowded around the old paper map spread across the tactical table while the digital systems continued flickering with corrupted coordinates and broken terrain overlays. Captain Ethan Cole stared down at the faded markings covering the map. Handwritten route corrections crossed over official military grid lines. Entire sections of mountain terrain had been circled in dark ink beside warning notes dated years earlier. One phrase repeated several times along the northern ridge caught his attention immediately. Magnetic drift after sundown. Avoid valley floor. Ethan looked back up at Claire Donovan with a different expression now, though pride still fought hard to stay alive behind his eyes. White Ember was classified, he said carefully. Most officers at this base have never even seen those files. Claire folded one side of the map open farther, revealing another hidden layer beneath the protective plastic. That is because Command buried the operation after the rescue failed. Her voice remained calm, almost detached, but something colder moved underneath it now. Not anger. Memory. The communications officer suddenly raised a hand. Signal coming through again. Static flooded the room before a strained voice returned through the speakers. Falcon Team to Command, we lost visual markers, snow depth increasing, compass drift is getting worse. Ethan stepped forward immediately. Falcon Team, hold current position. We are correcting your extraction route now. The response came after several seconds of interference. Sir, current position may not be safe. Claire's eyes shifted toward the map again before she spoke quietly. They are already descending too far. Ethan looked at her sharply. What does that mean? She pointed toward a narrow frozen corridor marked between two ridgelines. Cold air sinks through this section after dark. Visibility collapses first. Then the signal dies completely. One of the lieutenants frowned. That area is not marked hazardous. Claire glanced at him only briefly. Because satellites cannot see what happens beneath the ice fog. The room fell silent again. Even the younger officers who had mocked her earlier now listened carefully, their confidence slowly replaced by unease. Ethan noticed something else too. Claire never raised her voice. Never tried to prove herself. She simply spoke like someone who already knew exactly what would happen next. A senior operations commander entered the war room carrying a classified tablet under one arm. Colonel Marcus Hale had spent nearly 25 years in Arctic operations, and very little surprised him anymore. But the moment he saw the old paper map on the table, his entire expression changed. His eyes moved slowly toward Claire Donovan. Then, to the shock of nearly everyone in the room, the colonel stood completely still for half a second before giving her a sharp military nod. Captain Donovan, he said quietly. I was told you declined reassignment 6 years ago. Ethan blinked in confusion. Several officers immediately straightened their posture without fully understanding why. Claire met the colonel's gaze calmly. I did. Colonel Hale looked down at the map again. And yet Command still keeps your Arctic survival doctrine locked behind level 7 clearance. Nobody spoke. Ethan felt the air inside the room shift completely. He had spent the last 20 minutes treating her like an unwanted civilian while one of the most respected commanders at Fort Sentinel addressed her with visible respect. Hale turned toward the tactical display. Status of Falcon Team. Signal unstable, sir, the communications specialist answered quickly. Navigation failure due to storm interference. Claire slowly traced one gloved finger across the old map. Not interference, she said quietly. Reflection. Ethan frowned. Reflection from what? Claire looked toward the frozen darkness beyond the reinforced windows. The ice shelf beneath them. Before anyone could respond, every light inside the war room flickered once. Then the main tactical screen went completely black. Darkness rolled across the war room as the main tactical display shut down without warning. For 1/10 second, the only light came from emergency backup panels glowing dim red against the steel walls. Wind screamed outside the base hard enough to rattle ceiling vents while warning alarms pulsed somewhere deep in the corridor beyond the operations center. Several officers immediately moved toward the dead screen, tapping controls and checking frozen system panels. Satellite uplink is gone, one technician said nervously. Primary grid just crashed. Colonel Marcus Hale stayed focused on Claire Donovan instead. Unlike everyone else in the room, she did not seem surprised. She stood beside the old paper map with the same calm expression she had carried since walking through the checkpoint during the storm. Ethan Cole watched her carefully now, trying to reconcile the quiet woman he mocked less than an hour earlier with the person standing calmly in the middle of a collapsing tactical operation. The communications desk crackled again. Falcon Team to command. Static swallowed most of the transmission before the voice returned weaker than before. We lost visual contact with Ridge Marker 7, snow drift reaching 6 feet. Ethan grabbed the radio microphone immediately. Falcon Team, maintain current heading and conserve battery power. Claire looked up sharply. No. Ethan turned toward her. Excuse me. If they stay on their current heading, they will descend directly into the lower ice basin. Her voice stayed low, but every officer nearby immediately stopped talking. Claire stepped closer to the old map and pressed 2 fingers against a narrow section buried beneath faded handwritten notes. The basin looks stable during daylight. At night, the wind seals the upper layer with fresh powder. Nobody notices the drop until the ground disappears beneath them. One young lieutenant frowned. That terrain is not even marked on modern satellite scans. Claire did not look at him. Because the basin shifts every winter. Colonel Hale folded his arms slowly. You have seen it happen before. Claire remained silent for a moment. The red emergency lights reflected faintly across the frost scars on her hands. Then she answered quietly. Twice. Nobody asked what happened those 2 times. Something in her voice discouraged curiosity. Ethan glanced back at the dead tactical display before lowering his eyes toward the paper map again. For the first time all night, he realized the old handwritten markings contained more reliable information than every digital system surrounding them. A technician rushed toward Colonel Hale carrying a tablet running on backup power. Sir, long-range radar confirms severe magnetic interference across the eastern shelf. Drone navigation is completely unreliable. Claire nodded once, almost to herself. The storm hit earlier than expected. Ethan stared at her. How could you possibly know that? She traced a gloved finger along one side of the map where several tiny notes had been written beside weather measurements from years earlier. Because Arctic storms do not move randomly. The ice reflects pressure patterns long before radar sees them. The room fell quiet again. Every officer listened now. Not because of rank. Not because Colonel Hale respected her. They listened because she spoke about the frozen wilderness the way experienced sailors spoke about the ocean. Like it was alive. Another burst of static exploded through the communication speakers. Then a strained voice pushed through the interference. Command, visibility near 0, we cannot identify the extraction ridge. Ethan looked immediately toward Claire. She studied the map for only 2 seconds before pointing toward a narrow route cutting west through the mountains. Tell them to turn heading 264 immediately. Full climb for 300 yards before descending again. Ethan hesitated. That route is not on the approved extraction plan. Claire finally looked directly at him again. Neither is surviving this storm. Colonel Hale answered before Ethan could speak. Transmit her coordinates. The communications officer obeyed instantly. Around the room, nobody questioned the order. Nobody laughed anymore. Outside, the storm continued swallowing the world beyond Fort Sentinel while Claire Donovan quietly folded back one corner of the old paper map. Beneath it, hidden until now, was another set of handwritten markings labeled with a classified operation name Ethan Cole had only heard whispered once before. Operation Frozen Divide. The red emergency lights cast long shadows across the war room as the storm continued battering Fort Sentinel from every direction. Wind howled through the outer structures hard enough to make the reinforced ceiling panels vibrate overhead. Nobody paid attention anymore. Every set of eyes remained fixed on the old map spread across the steel table and the quiet woman standing beside it. Captain Ethan Cole felt the atmosphere inside the room changing by the minute. Earlier that night, officers barely acknowledged Claire Donovan as anything more than an inconvenience. Now even senior commanders waited for her to speak before making decisions. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Colonel Marcus Hale studied the newly revealed markings hidden beneath the folded section of the map. "Frozen Divide," he said quietly. "I thought those files were sealed permanently." Claire adjusted one corner of the paper carefully. "Most of them were." Ethan stepped closer, unable to hide his curiosity anymore. What exactly was Frozen Divide? Claire did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained focused on the map while distant radio chatter crackled softly through the communication speakers behind them. Finally she spoke. "A long-range Arctic reconnaissance operation conducted 9 years ago." One of the younger lieutenants frowned. "I never heard about it at the academy." Colonel Hale gave a humorless smile. "You were not supposed to." Silence settled over the room again. The only sounds came from static bursts through the radios and the constant storm outside. Claire traced another narrow route through the mountains with one gloved finger. The mission lasted 12 days. It ended after the storm changed direction 48 hours earlier than forecast. Ethan noticed the way several older officers lowered their eyes slightly. Whatever happened during Frozen Divide was not ordinary military history. Claire continued speaking in the same calm tone she had used all night, but now every word carried weight. Navigation systems failed first. Then communications. Temperatures dropped to 60 below zero before sunrise. One officer quietly muttered, "Nobody survives conditions like that for long." Claire looked at him briefly. "Most do not." Nobody asked who survived. Deep down, everyone in the room already understood the answer standing in front of them. The communications desk suddenly erupted with static again. "Falcon team to command, adjusting heading now." A burst of interference swallowed the next few words before the signal returned clearer than before. "Visibility improving slightly." Ethan released a breath he did not realize he had been holding. The route Claire provided was working. Around the room, officers exchanged relieved looks while technicians rushed to stabilize weakened signal feeds. Claire showed almost no reaction. She simply continued studying the terrain with complete focus. Ethan watched her quietly for several seconds before speaking again. "You knew this storm before it even arrived. You knew the terrain shifts. You knew the extraction failure before our systems did." Claire slowly folded one section of the map closed. "Because storms like this do not change." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Her pale eyes lifted toward the frozen darkness beyond the reinforced windows. "The Arctic remembers every mistake people make out there." Nobody laughed at the sentence. Somehow, inside the storm-shaken war room, it sounded less like philosophy and more like experience. Colonel Hale finally looked directly at Ethan Cole. "Captain, you should understand something." Ethan straightened instinctively. Hale nodded toward Claire Donovan. "The survival protocols every Arctic unit in this region uses today were written because of her." Ethan stared at Claire in stunned silence. Hale continued. "Every cold-weather extraction route. Every emergency shelter procedure. Every magnetic drift correction. Her work rebuilt Arctic operations after Frozen Divide." The room remained completely still. The younger officers who mocked her earlier now looked openly uncomfortable. One lieutenant slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor. Claire did not acknowledge any of it. She simply secured one of the old metal locks back onto the cylindrical case before speaking quietly into the silence. "Falcon team still has 19 miles left before extraction." Ethan looked back toward the communications desk. "Can they make it?" Claire's expression never changed. "Only if the ice shelf holds through the night." The storm pushed harder against Fort Sentinel as midnight settled across the Arctic mountains. Snow buried the outer fences almost completely now, and the floodlights beyond the reinforced windows glowed like fading stars trapped inside white darkness. Inside the war room, exhaustion slowly replaced adrenaline. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside frozen tactical screens while officers rotated through communication stations trying to maintain contact with Falcon Team. The signal came and went in broken fragments every few minutes. Captain Ethan Cole stood near the steel table staring at Claire Donovan's old paper map. The longer he looked at it, the more details appeared. Handwritten elevations. Wind shift patterns. Notes warning about hidden ice fractures. Entire sections had clearly been updated over years, maybe decades. Nothing about it looked academic. It looked lived in. Ethan finally glanced toward Claire herself. She stood near the emergency lights with her winter coat still on, quietly listening to the radio traffic while snow melted slowly from the edges of her boots onto the concrete floor. She looked less like a legendary Arctic specialist and more like someone who had simply learned to survive places other people avoided. Colonel Marcus Hale approached her carefully. "Command never expected you to come back here." Claire kept her eyes on the radio desk. "Neither did I." Hale folded his arms. "Then why return now?" For the first time all night, Claire hesitated before answering. Because the storm pattern matched Frozen Divide. The room quieted slightly at the operation name. Even officers pretending not to listen now paid attention. Hale lowered his voice. "Most people believed the reports were exaggerated." Claire gave a faint nod. "Most people read the cleaned version." Ethan looked between them. "What really happened out there?" Claire stayed silent for several seconds while static crackled through the speakers. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but something heavier moved underneath it now. "Our team entered the eastern shelf during a survey mission. Forecast called for stable weather." Her eyes drifted toward the storm outside. The forecast was wrong. Nobody interrupted her. Navigation systems failed on day 3. By day 5, temperatures dropped below 70 under zero with wind gusts over 90 miles per hour. One young lieutenant quietly whispered, "That is impossible survival territory." Claire did not react. The ice fog erased visibility completely. We could not tell sky from ground anymore. Ethan noticed the room growing still again. Every officer listened without moving. Claire's voice never became emotional. Somehow that made the story heavier instead of lighter. "We lost communication first. Then supplies. Then direction." Colonel Hale lowered his eyes slightly. He already knew how the story ended. Ethan could see it on his face. Claire continued quietly. "On the 11th night, the storm finally cleared enough for rescue aircraft to reach us." Ethan swallowed slowly. "How many made it out?" Claire's pale blue eyes stayed fixed on the frozen darkness outside the windows. 2. Silence filled the room completely. Even the radio static seemed quieter for a moment. Ethan suddenly understood the frost scars on her hands. The old notes covering the map. The way she spoke about storms like they were living things. Claire Donovan had not studied the Arctic from briefing rooms and satellite feeds. She survived it when almost nobody else did. The communication speakers burst alive again. "Falcon Team to command." The voice sounded clearer this time. "We reached the western climb route, visibility improving." Several officers released relieved breaths immediately. One technician actually smiled for the first time in hours. Ethan looked toward Claire again. She showed almost no visible reaction, but her shoulders relaxed slightly beneath the heavy winter coat. Colonel Hale noticed it too. "You still remember every inch of that terrain." Claire looked down at the old paper map one last time. "You do not forget places that nearly bury you alive." Nobody spoke after that. Outside, the Arctic storm continued roaring through the darkness, but inside Fort Sentinel, every officer in the war room finally understood the same thing. Claire Donovan was never just carrying a map. She was carrying the memory of surviving the worst night that frozen wilderness had ever created. The storm finally began shifting east just after 2 in the morning, but nobody inside Fort Sentinel relaxed. Arctic weather never truly ended. It only changed shape. Emergency generators hummed steadily beneath the operations floor while exhausted officers rotated between communications consoles and radar stations running on partial backup power. The air inside the war room smelled like burnt coffee, cold metal, and tension that had lasted too many hours. Captain Ethan Cole remained near Claire Donovan's map, studying details he had completely overlooked earlier that night. The old paper no longer looked outdated to him. It looked alive. Every handwritten correction represented something learned the hard way. Every warning line carried the weight of somebody surviving conditions satellites failed to understand. Across the room, radio chatter crackled again. Falcon team to command, approaching western shelf marker. The transmission sounded stronger now. Stable. Several technicians exchanged relieved glances while one of the younger officers quietly muttered, "They are actually going to make it." Claire stood near the dim emergency lights, calmly tightening the strap around the cylindrical map case. She looked exhausted for the first time all night. Not physically tired. Something deeper than that. Like the storm outside had reopened memories she spent years burying beneath silence. Colonel Marcus Hale noticed it too. "You should sit down for a minute." Claire gave a faint shake of her head. "Not until they clear the ice shelf." Ethan watched her quietly before finally speaking. "You came here tonight because you knew this storm could repeat what happened during Frozen Divide." Claire did not answer immediately. Then she looked toward him with the same steady expression she had carried since entering the base. "Storms repeat patterns. So do people." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He understood what she meant. Earlier that evening he dismissed her because she did not look important. Did not sound loud enough. Did not carry visible rank across her coat. Now the entire war room depended on knowledge she carried alone. A communications specialist suddenly straightened in his chair. "Sir, incoming encrypted channel from Northern Command." Colonel Hale stepped toward the console while the technician patched the audio through the room speakers. A sharp voice filled the war room almost instantly. "Fort Sentinel, confirm identity of civilian advisor Claire Donovan." Ethan frowned at the phrase civilian advisor. Colonel Hale answered calmly. "Identity confirmed." Several seconds of static followed before the voice returned. "Northern Command authorizes full operational authority under Arctic Continuity Protocol 7. The room went completely still. One lieutenant blinked in confusion. Another slowly looked toward Claire as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Ethan felt his stomach tighten slightly. Operational authority under Protocol 7 was not normal authorization. It was emergency command clearance reserved for specialized survival operations. Claire showed almost no reaction. She simply reached for the old paper map again and unfolded one final hidden section near the bottom edge. Several officers stepped closer instinctively. Beneath the folded layer was an entirely different set of markings drawn in dark blue ink. Emergency shelters. Ice tunnel routes. Weather fallback positions. The hidden infrastructure of the Arctic itself. Ethan stared at the markings in disbelief. None of this exists on official military maps. Claire secured one corner beneath a flashlight beam. Because these routes were never meant for regular deployment. Colonel Hale looked toward her carefully. "You built all of this after Frozen Divide." Claire nodded once. Every team lost in Arctic operations after that storm died because nobody understood how fast the terrain changes under pressure. The room remained silent as she pointed toward a narrow tunnel marker hidden beneath overlapping ridge lines. "That passage stays stable during magnetic storms. Falcon team can reach extraction there." Ethan finally understood the full truth. Claire Donovan was not simply a survivor of Frozen Divide. She became the reason future teams survived at all. Outside, the storm clouds slowly drifted beyond the mountains while inside Fort Sentinel, every officer in the room stood quietly around the old paper map created by the woman they almost threw out into the snow just hours earlier. By 3:30 in the morning, the storm had weakened enough for parts of the mountain range to become visible again beyond the frozen windows of Fort Sentinel. Jagged ridgelines appeared and disappeared beneath drifting sheets of snow while pale moonlight reflected faintly across the endless ice fields surrounding the base. Inside the war room, nobody had left their station in hours. Exhaustion hung over the room like another layer of cold. Yet every officer remained focused on the same thing now. Falcon Team was still moving. The communications desk crackled with intermittent updates every few minutes as the stranded unit followed Claire Donovan's hidden extraction route through the western shelf. Each transmission sounded steadier than the last. Captain Ethan Cole stood beside the steel table watching Claire carefully while she updated route markings across the old paper map using a black grease pencil worn nearly to the metal tip. Her movement stayed calm and precise despite the pressure surrounding her. Ethan realized she never wasted motion. Every line she drew mattered. Every correction came from memory instead of guesswork. A technician looked up from the radar station. Thermal signatures detected near Tunnel Ridge. Colonel Marcus Hale stepped closer immediately. Falcon Team. The technician nodded slowly. Looks like it. A quiet wave of relief moved through the room. Several officers leaned back in their chairs for the first time all night while others exchanged tired smiles. Claire remained focused on the map. "Do not celebrate yet," she said quietly. "Tunnel Ridge destabilizes during late pressure shifts." Ethan frowned. "You mean avalanches?" Claire shook her head once. "Ice collapse." Nobody needed further explanation. Colonel Hale turned toward the communications desk. "Warn Falcon Team to maintain spacing through the ridge corridor." The order went out immediately. Several seconds later, a voice answered through heavy static. "Understood, Command, proceeding with caution." Ethan looked toward Claire again. "You really memorized this entire region." Claire capped the grease pencil and slid it carefully back into the cylindrical case. "You learn quickly when mistakes stay buried under snow for years." The room fell quiet again. Nobody missed the meaning behind her words anymore. Outside, the storm clouds continued drifting eastward while weak emergency floodlights illuminated the frozen runway beyond the base. For the first time since Claire arrived, the atmosphere inside Fort Sentinel no longer felt chaotic. It felt disciplined. Focused. Like every person inside the room had unconsciously aligned around her calm presence without realizing it. Then the communication speakers burst alive again. "Falcon Team to command." This time the voice sounded stronger than ever. "We reached the extraction marker." A technician immediately checked the thermal feed. "Confirmed. 8 heat signatures holding position near Tunnel Ridge." Several officers quietly applauded under their breath while one exhausted communications specialist nearly collapsed back into his chair from relief. Ethan released a long breath and looked toward Claire Donovan. She finally allowed herself the smallest visible reaction of the night. A single slow nod. Colonel Hale folded his arms and smiled faintly. "You just saved an entire reconnaissance team." Claire secured the final lock on the cylindrical case. "The map did." Ethan shook his head quietly. "No. You did." For the first time all night, Claire looked directly at him without the cold distance she carried earlier. There was no anger in her eyes. No satisfaction either. Just quiet understanding. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, remembering every dismissive word he said when she first walked into the war room wearing a snow-covered coat and carrying old paper maps nobody respected. The same officers who laughed at her now waited for her approval before making decisions. A transport pilot suddenly entered through the operations doors, snow still clinging to his flight jacket. "Rescue aircraft is inbound," he announced. "Arrival in 7 minutes." The room relaxed all at once. Conversations resumed softly. Chairs shifted. Coffee was poured again. But one thing had changed permanently inside Fort Sentinel that night. Nobody in the room saw Claire Donovan as an outsider anymore. They saw her the way Arctic veterans always had. As the woman who understood the frozen wilderness better than the machines built to map it. The rescue aircraft touched down at Fort Sentinel just before dawn. Snow swirled violently beneath the helicopter rotors as ground crews rushed across the frozen landing zone guiding Falcon team toward the operations building. Through the reinforced windows of the war room, exhausted officers watched dark silhouettes emerge from the storm one by one, covered in frost and ice but still walking under their own strength. A quiet sense of relief spread through the room, stronger than any celebration. Nobody needed speeches. The fact that all 8 team members returned alive said enough. Captain Ethan Cole stood near the steel table while technicians slowly restored the main tactical systems one screen at a time. Bright digital maps flickered back to life across the walls, but somehow they no longer felt as important as the old paper map resting inside Claire Donovan's cylindrical case. Hours earlier, most people in the room trusted satellites more than experience. Nobody made that mistake now. Colonel Marcus Hale watched the rescue crews below for a moment before turning toward Claire. Northern Command will want a full briefing from you by morning. Claire tightened the final strap on the map case and slipped one glove back over the frost scars on her hand. They already have the map. Hale gave a faint smile. I do not think they were asking about the map. Claire did not answer. Ethan noticed that about her now. She never chased recognition. Never explained herself unless survival required it. Everything about her felt earned instead of announced. Across the room, one of the younger lieutenants slowly approached her, visibly uncomfortable. Earlier that night he laughed with the others when she first entered the war room carrying the old cylindrical case through the snow. Now he avoided direct eye contact entirely. Captain Donovan, he said quietly. I just wanted to say. He hesitated. Claire looked at him calmly, waiting. The young officer swallowed hard. We misjudged you. The war room grew quiet again. Several nearby officers lowered their eyes slightly, knowing the apology belonged to more than one person. Claire studied the exhausted lieutenant for a moment before answering in the same steady tone she had used all night. The Arctic does not care about appearances. Nobody spoke after that because nobody could argue with it. Outside, the storm clouds finally began breaking apart over the mountains as pale morning light touched the frozen landscape surrounding Fort Sentinel. For the first time in hours, the endless snowfields looked calm. Ethan walked toward Claire slowly while the rest of the room returned to post-operation work around them. You knew exactly who we were when you walked in here tonight, he said quietly. Claire glanced toward him. Ethan gave a faint, embarrassed smile. A group of officers too busy trusting screens to notice the person carrying the answers. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. You were trying to protect your team, she replied. Fear makes people loud sometimes. Ethan nodded once, accepting the truth of it. Then, without another word, he stepped back and stood straighter as Claire prepared to leave the war room. Nearby officers noticed immediately. One by one, conversations stopped. Chairs shifted. Slowly, quietly, every person inside the operations center rose to their feet as Claire Donovan walked toward the exit carrying the old cylindrical case beneath one arm. No announcement was given. No command was spoken. Respect moved through the room naturally this time. Claire paused briefly near the doorway as cold morning light spilled through the corridor beyond. She looked back only once. Her pale blue eyes moved across the war room, the restored tactical screens, the exhausted officers, and finally the frozen mountains visible through the distant windows. Maps change, she said quietly. Storms change faster. Pay attention to the people who have already survived them. Then she turned and disappeared down the corridor alone while the officers of Fort Sentinel remained standing silently behind her, listening to the fading sound of her boots against the cold concrete floor.